Masonic Ritual, How Did It Come About? By Michael Barnes, brought to you by Masonic Audiobook Library. With the exception of the Craft and Royal Arch, the governing bodies of all recognized Masonic orders exercise central control under their jurisdiction over the ritual practiced by the lodges, councils, conclaves, or whatever the unit may be called. Because of the way that the craft developed from very early times, there was considerable diversity of practice from one part of the country to another, and particularly between the lodges under the two rival Grand Lodges, the Premier and the Ancient Grand Lodges. To pave the way for the union of these two Grand Lodges, a Lodge of Promulgation was formed in 1809 under the Premier Grand Lodge, or Moderns, to examine the ritual and make recommendations. Following the union in 1813, a Lodge of Reconciliation was established to complete the rationalization of the ritual into a form acceptable to both parties forming the newly constituted United Grand Lodge. Its other main function was to demonstrate the unified ritual. Representatives of lodges in London and the provinces were invited to attend special demonstrations organized by the experts from the Lodge of Reconciliation, which completed its work in 1816. However, because it was forbidden to print the ritual or even produce written manuscripts, so the communication of the work to the various lodges relied heavily on the ability, not to mention the memory, of those attending the demonstrations. Their task was then to instruct their own members in the approved practices. In addition to the difficulty of interpretation, doubtless there would also have been the desire to improvise, a trait, dare one say, recognized in some present-day preceptors. In view of these hazards, it is surprising how much uniformity was achieved. All present rituals are derived from the Lodge of Reconciliation ritual, and apart from a few lodges in Bristol and the north of England, which retains more of the earlier practices, the degree of variation is quite small. Ironically, most of our knowledge of ritual before the Union comes from the early anti-Masonic exposure in England and France. The first ritual was probably a simple ceremony of admission, which developed into 2 degrees, and, at about the time when the first Grand Lodge was formed in 1717, into a system of 3 degrees. These early ceremonies were mainly delivered in catechetical form and were evidently briefer and less well-structured than the later ceremonies. Early ritual was also Christian in content. Indeed, the Premier Grand Lodge met on St. John's Day, 24th June. The work of the Lodge of Reconciliation between 1813 and 1816 included demonstrations of the opening and closing ceremonies, the obligations, and the perambulations. It was probably also when most of the Christian references were removed, although some remain in the present ritual. Since that time, and until recent years, Grand Lodge has kept clear of involvement in ritual, and has never officially recognized any particular working. Lodges were then, and are to this day, free to teach and practice whatever ritual they wish, provided the landmarks are not breached. Private lodges of instruction were already in existence in the 18th century. However, the earliest one still in existence was that founded by the Lodge of Stability in 1817. This was followed by the Emulation Lodge of Improvement in 1823. Soon after this, 2 very important figures in the development of craft ritual emerged, namely Peter Gilks, who joined Emulation in 1825, and George Claret, both of whom had attended the Lodge of Reconciliation on a number of occasions. Gilks was a prominent teacher of emulation, and 2 years after his death, in 1833, Claret published a book of ritual that included Gilks' teaching. In 1838, he published another ritual book, which included the 3 degrees questions before passing and raising, and the installation of the master and officers. These books were probably the first regular ritual books to be published. This is somewhat surprising because at this time the printing of ritual was still strictly frowned upon by Grand Lodge, and several later authors were firmly admonished for such transgressions. After Claret's death in 1850, his widow continued to sell the book until 1870. Further editions were published, the last in 1873, but it was effectively superseded in 1871 by a book entitled The Perfect Ceremonies, which purported to be the current emulation teaching. In view of these developments, it seems surprising that the earliest known teaching body, Stability, did not publish its ritual until 1902, and the Emulation Lodge of Improvement first published its approved ritual as recently as 1969. Towards the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, an increased number of rituals emerged. Today there are some 40 published rituals and several hundred smaller workings, some unique to particular lodges. Emulation is the most widely used. Some rituals are practiced within certain provinces, such as the Oxford working and the Sussex working, and many others are popular in particular geographic areas. For Taylor's working, the first edition of the ritual book under its present title N.M. Taylor's Handbook of Craft Freemasonry was published in 1908, the second edition in 1975, the third in 1991, and the fourth in 2000. Prior to 1908, the work was called the Manual of Craft Freemasonry and was first published by M.M. Taylor in 1900, the copyright being held by Henry Hill, who was initiated in Street Marylebone Lodge No. 1305 in 1874 and was master in 1885. Researches by Roy Fisher, currently life president of the association, suggest that Taylor, who started his printing business in 1863, began publishing and printing for Hill about 1897. A few years before this, during the 1880s, Logic, West End, and Oxford rituals were published, and it is believed that the precursor of Taylor's working, known as Hill's North London working, appeared in the same period. The only printed material for this working that has been traced is a booklet questions, which must be answered by the candidate before passing. A comparison of Taylor's ritual with others of the same period and earlier leads to the belief that Hill's North London working was derived from Claridge's working, the seventh and last edition of which was published in 1873. It is pure conjecture, but perfectly plausible, that Hill's Lodge, which works emulation, would probably have used Claridge's working until the supply of books ran out, when they would have used the perfect ceremonies. Hill, after his year as master in 1885, may have seized the opportunity to reissue Claret under his own title. At present, this is the best that can be offered for the original of Taylor's ritual. Apart from stability, emulation, and logic working, very little was heard about teaching bodies for Masonic ritual until recent years. Why did users of Taylor's handbook, along with adherents to several other rituals, some 60 years after the book was first published, decide that they needed an association to control the ritual? As stated earlier, Grand Lodge had not deliberated on matters of ritual since the Lodge of Reconciliation closed in 1816. But in 1964 they did, and it was precisely for this reason that a number of hitherto unattached workings, such as Taylor's and Universal, were brought under the control of ritual associations. At the quarterly communication of Grand Lodge held on 6 December 1964, a resolution in the name of Bishop Herbert, Provincial Grand Master for Norfolk, to approve a permissive variation to the working of the penalties in the craft obligations, was duly passed. The alternative working to be used, and the way it would be incorporated within the ritual, would be left to the discretion of the teaching bodies in particular, and generally to the multitude of lodges of instruction which used the unattached workings like Taylor's. In May 1965, Harry Kerr, then Secretary of Quatuor Coronati Lodge No. 2076, the premier lodge of Masonic research, presided over a meeting of representatives of a number of lodges using the more popular of the unattached workings. The main object of the meeting was to agree on a standard form of wording for the permissive variations, based on the form already adopted by the established teaching bodies. After the meeting, 5 brethren representing lodges that used Taylor's working formed an ad hoc committee. Much effort was involved, particularly in trying to trace lodges that used the ritual. A meeting of representatives of Taylor's lodges was convened on 30 November 1965, and they formed the Association of Taylor's Working, and the inaugural meeting was held on 31 January 1967. The plans included the production of a new edition of the ritual book, the setting up of a team to demonstrate the working, and the formation of a lodge of improvement. The second edition of the handbook was published in 1975, some 68 years after the first edition. Taylor's Lodge of Improvement held its first meeting in February 1976. Regular demonstrations of the work started in 1968, the first being attended by 545 brethren. After 100 years of publishing Masonic Ritual, M.N. Taylor sold the publishing rights to Ian Allen Publishing in 1996. The late M.M. Marlborough Milbank Taylor, who died on 31 August 1999, was the grandson of the original publisher. An embroidered drape was produced for the master's pedestal incorporating the familiar M&T logo, the one that appears at the front of all Taylor's ritual books, in full color. This now takes pride of place at the LOA. Following the publication of a new edition, almost all changes are to the rubric and explanatory notes. These are now much more extensive than in earlier editions. Changes to the spoken ritual are almost entirely corrections to grammar, spelling, and punctuation. In certain cases, we resort to the ultimate weapon, a quote from then Grand Secretary Sir James Stubbs to a paper by the distinguished Masonic author Colin Dyer entitled In Search of Ritual Uniformity. While nothing will induce me publicly to compare one ritual's virtues and failings with another's, I can, and will say that what is thoroughly reprehensible is the practice, all too common among senior past masters who have become DCs and preceptors, of culling different tidbits from various rituals they have heard or misheard, and incorporating them in what they purport to teach. A ritual is not the sum of the whims of the lodge's often self-appointed expert. It is something which should be laid down by the teaching authorities, and from it there should be no deviation. TC Transactions, Vol. 86, p. 166 to 167. Next we have Our Ritual, a Study in Its Development by Bro. J. Mason Allen. It may come as a surprise to many brethren to learn that our craft ritual, in the form in which we know it today, does not date farther back than 1835 or thereabouts. That does not mean, of course, that the elements of which it is composed, or at least most of them, do not go back very far indeed. But it does mean that we have no evidence that these elements were combined before that date into the peculiar system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbol with which we are familiar today. It will be our present purpose to pass under review some early Masonic records, and from them establish historical facts on which the foregoing conclusion is based, and at the same time to present some other considerations that may have a bearing upon the development of our ritual. Most craftsmen believe, and believe correctly, that the Freemasonry of today is, in a very real sense, the lineal descendant of the old Masons' Guild. In the Middle Ages, many trades had their guilds, but the Masons' Guild differed from all the others in two very important respects. In the first place, most tradesmen carried on their vocations in fixed localities where they were all well known to one another and to their employers. But the Masons, because of the nature of their work, were necessarily mobile, settled for a time while engaged on the building of, say, a cathedral or a royal palace, and when their work there was completed, traveling, sometimes a considerable distance, to the site of the next building on which they would be employed. They were not so well known to one another or to employers of labor, and when one professing to be a Mason presented himself at a building site seeking employment, it was necessary for the employer not only to prove, by a practical test, that the man was capable of skilled work, but also to be satisfied that he had been regularly received into the guild, a necessary condition of employment in those days. Hence the need for such test questions as we find in the Catechism part of the Edinburgh Register House MS, 1696, some questions that Masons used to put to those who have the word before they will acknowledge them. In the second place, the Masons alone had charges that were addressed to apprentices when they were indentured to their masters. These are commonly spoken of as the old charges. The two oldest that have been preserved are the Regius Poem. It is written in rhyme, believed to date from 1390, and the Cook MS, about 1425. Another in the possession of the Grand Lodge of England is dated 1583, and some others were written in the 17th century. Brothers Pick and Knight, in their Pocket History of Freemasonry, page 28, say, although parallels may be found here and there, no other medieval body, whether craft, religious, or otherwise, is known to have possessed such documents. They also say, page 166, it is remarkable that Scotland produced no traditional history such as England had from about 1400 in the old charges. The few copies associated with Scotland are obviously copied from England. Indeed, one or two naively require the craftsman to be true to the King of England. A short description of elements that are common to all or most of these old charges will be of interest and are relevant to our present purpose. They all open with a prayer which, as is to be expected at that period, is definitely Christian in character, including an invocation of the Holy Trinity. Then follows a traditional history of the craft, which is in many respects fantastic, but which contains some elements that are not unfamiliar to us today. They deal with the 7 liberal arts and sciences: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These arts and sciences were written on 2 pillars of stone. The one stone was called marble, that cannot burn with fire. The other was called lateral, lay, brick, or tile, that cannot drown with water. That detail, with a slight modification and transposition, will be familiar to many. And there are some students who believe that we have here the original legend of 2 pillars, a later version of which finds embodiment in other pillars that are alluded to in the Edinburgh Register House MS, in all the 18th century catechisms, and in our present-day rituals. At this point, several versions of the old charges require the apprentice to take an OB on the VSL, then follow the general charges, which relate not only to the craft and its secrets, but also to general conduct. The apprentice is charged: 1. To be true to God and Holy Church. 2. To be a true liegeman to the king and his council. 3. To be true to one another, and to do to others as he would that others should do to him. 4. To keep the secrets of the craft. 5. Not to be a thief. 6. To be loyal to his master, and to serve him for his profit and advantage. 7. To call masons fellows or brothers, and no foul name, not to take a fellow's wife violently, nor his daughter ungodly, nor his servant in villainy. 8. To pay his way honestly, wherever he may go. And 9. To do no villainy in any house where he may be entertained. Then follow some particular charges for masters and fellows, but these relate entirely to the operative work of the craft. These details are given here for 3 reasons. 1. Because in them we can recognize much that is in the ethical instruction given in our modern ritual. 2. Because the method of giving such a charge is continued in the charges that are given today at the conclusion of the ceremonies of entering, passing, and raising, and also in the charges read to the master of a lodge at his installation. And 3. Because failure to read these old charges was one of the allegations brought by the antients against the moderns, which will be dealt with later. Thus it can be clearly seen that any study of the development of our ritual must begin with the old charges and their contents. In the days when Masons followed the work from building site to building site, a lodge would be formed at each site. This was probably discontinued gradually as the erection of great buildings such as cathedrals, palaces, or castles grew less, and Masons became more settled in towns where they were employed in more ordinary building. Then they formed what Brother Douglas Knoop calls territorial lodges. The Shaw Statutes, 1599, make mention of lodges at Edinburgh, Kilwinning, and Stirling, and these 3 lodges are still actively working. Knoop and Jones, in the Genesis of Freemasonry, page 52, state that the only independent evidence of the ownership or the use of versions of the MS, constitutions, the old charges, by operative Masons relates to lodges at Stirling, Melrose, Kilwinning, Aberdeen, Dumfries, Aitchison's Haven, Alnwick, and Swalwell. 6 of these 8 lodges were in Scotland, but it is interesting to note that the Lodge of Edinburgh is not included. The other 2 lodges were in Northumberland, and both had a very close linkage, Masonically, with Scotland. See the Genesis of Freemasonry, pages 221 and 222. This list is given here to establish 2 points. 1. That lodges at that time were localized or territorial, and 2. That the old charges continued to be used after the lodges were so localized. Pick and Knight, in their Pocket History, page 172, state that in England the operative lodge is almost unknown. Presumably they mean in a territorious sense. When Elias Ashmole was admitted to the lodge at Warrington in 1646, none but non-operative Masons were present. It was no doubt after the settling of lodges at fixed centers that non-operative members began to be admitted. The earliest record of a non-operative being present at a meeting of an operative lodge is to be found in the minutes of the Lodge of Edinburgh for 8 June 1600, which were attested by all present, including James Boswell of Auchinleck, an ancestor of the biographer of Dever Johnson. 3 others were admitted to the same lodge in 1634, 12 years before the admission of Elias Ashmole to the lodge at Warrington. The 17th century may be regarded as the period when the transition from operative to speculative got well underway. Influence in that direction no doubt came from men like Ashmole and Sir Robert Murray, one of the founders of the Royal Society, who was admitted by the Lodge of Edinburgh at a meeting in Newcastle on 20th May 1641, and possibly, indirectly, from others of similar interests. Space does not permit of enlarging upon this matter, but one brief quotation, which may later be found to have considerable relevance to our present study, may be given from a well-known Masonic historian, Robert Freak Gould. In his History of Freemasonry, Vol. IA, page 138, he expresses the opinion that during the 16th and 17th centuries, Kabbalism and Rosicrucianism profoundly influenced many secret societies in Europe, and Freemasonry received no slight tinge from the Kabbalist pursuits of some of its adherents at that time. Brother Gould, a doughty champion of the principles of the authentic school of Masonic historians, was exceedingly cautious and careful in his scrutiny of evidence, and we may take it that he would not have ventured to make such a categorical statement unless he was satisfied that it was fully justified by the cumulative effect of all the available evidence, no doubt in great measure circumstantial. Such a statement by such a man is worthy of the most serious consideration. He is certainly supported in his statement by a still more learned student of Masonic and cognate matters, who, however, approaches the subject from a somewhat different angle, Brother A. E. Waite, who says, "It seems to me quite certain that Kabbalism has transmitted elements to our secret societies, and it is not less certain that the men who elaborated our Masonic rituals had some personal knowledge of the secret doctrine of the Kabbalah." He was, of course, referring to our modern rituals. Towards the end of the 17th century, we come to the Edinburgh Register House MS, which is the first of a series of catechisms which continued to appear until well into the 18th century. Three of these, the Edinburgh Register House MS, 1696, the Graham MS, 1726, and Masonry Dissected, 1730, were dealt with in detail in an article on the 5 Points of Fellowship in the Grand Lodge of Scotland Yearbook for 1959. Here it is proposed only to pick out 1 or 2 points that are relevant to our immediate purpose. These catechisms are not ritual, as we now understand that word. They consist of questions and answers which, however, refer back in specific terms to some ceremony that had taken place previously. Of these ceremonies themselves we know nothing except what may be inferred from the questions and answers. They were probably very short and simple, restricted to the formal introduction of new apprentices and fellows, and the communication of the word and other secrets. That there was possibly no set form for this may be gathered from the narrative portion of the Edinburgh Register House MS. There we read, "Then all the Masons present whisper among themselves the word, beginning with the youngest, until it come to the master Mason who gives the word to the entered apprentice." In this short quotation there are 2 expressions that call for comment as relevant to our present purpose, the word and entered apprentice. The earliest known reference to the Mason word is in the Muses Threnody, a metrical account of Perth and neighborhood by Henry Adamson, published in Edinburgh in 1638, which contains these lines, "For we be brethren of the Rosy Cross, we have the Mason word and second sight." Brother Douglas Knoop, in the Genesis of Freemasonry, page 222, says that there is no evidence to show that the Mason word was ever used among English operative Masons, except possibly in the North. These last words would cover such lodges as those at Alnwick and Swalwell already mentioned. He also says, page 223, that various entries in lodge records in the 17th and 18th centuries referred to the Mason word. Those records, without exception, refer to Scottish lodges. And finally, he says, page 224, the purpose of the Mason word was to distinguish Masons who were members of their trade organization from others who were not. The need for some secret method of recognition arose from 2 conditions peculiar to Scotland, viz., the possibility of employment open to Cowans, and the existence of an industrial grade without exact parallel in England, that of entered apprentice. Apprentices who were bound to their masters by indenture did not require any special mode of recognition. But when they had completed their indentured service, they became entered apprentices. Journeymen they would be called today. The expression entered apprentices was not known in England until the publication of the first book of Constitution in 1723, which was compiled by Reverend James Anderson, D.D., a Scotsman. In passing, it may be remarked that Fellow of Craft is also distinctively Scottish. It appears in the Shaw Statutes, 1599, but in England it was not known until 1723, and there it is generally used without the of, Fellow Craft. Let us now revert to the Graham MS, 1726, which is of special importance for a study of the development of our ritual. This MS makes very clear reference to King Solomon and Hiram Abiff and their respective parts in the building of the temple, 480 years after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, that Solomon began to build the house of the Lord. Now we read in the 13th verse of the 7th chapter of the 1st book of Kings that Solomon sent and fetched Hiram out of Tyre, he being a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass, and he came to King Solomon and wrought all his work for him. This is very familiar to us, but the MS does not go on to give us the legend of our 3rd degree which has Hiram as its central figure. Instead, it does give practically all the ingredients of that legend in a very different setting, with a traditional history of which Noah was the central figure, which may be taken as about 1,300 years before the building of King Solomon's temple. By the death of Noah, some secret knowledge was lost. His 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, went to their father's grave to try if they could find anything about him to lead them to the virtual secrets which this famous preacher had. But before they went they had already agreed that if they did not find the very thing itself, the first thing they found was to be to them as a secret. There we have the earliest reference to substituted secrets. When they came to the grave, they found nothing but the dead body almost consumed away. Because of its condition, their first efforts to raise it failed. But ultimately, they raised up the dead body, setting foot to foot, knee to knee, breast to breast, cheek to cheek, and hand to back. In this old Noah legend, the MS gives several other details that are almost identical with elements in our Hiramic legend, and also, incidentally, it contains some dramatic details with which our modern mark degree has made us familiar. The first record of the Hiramic legend appears in Samuel Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, which was published in 1730, 4 years after the date of the Graham MS. The appearance at dates so close to one another, of two legends so similar in content but so vastly different in setting and in the periods to which they are assigned by their respective traditional histories, is very striking indeed. In this connection, brothers Pick and Knight, in their Pocket History of Freemasonry, page 70, say it is probable that before the craft finally settled on the building of King Solomon's Temple and the loss and recovery of certain knowledge, other prototypes were tried out, perhaps by small groups of Masons in isolated parts of the country. We may agree, broadly, with what is implied in this conjecture, but it raises two very interesting questions. One, who, at this period, constituted the craft, which ultimately decided in favor of the Hiramic version, or more briefly, who made the decision? And two, did they come to their decision deliberately after a consideration of the experiments made with various prototypes? We shall have occasion to revert to these questions at a later stage. In 1717, the first Grand Lodge of England had been formed. Its jurisdiction was at first confined to London and Westminster, but it gradually spread throughout England, where many lodges had long been functioning. There had also been many lodges actively operating in Ireland and Scotland. The Grand Lodge of Ireland was formed in 1725 and the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736. These simple historical facts are stated to introduce the next phase of our study in the development of our ritual. According to Bernard Jones in the Freemasons' Guide and Compendium, page 195, Freemasons from Ireland and Scotland were drifting into England and bringing with them ideas which had grown up not on English soil, but which nevertheless were very precious to those who held them. Grand Lodge was probably very worried, somewhere about 1730, at the number of unaffiliated Masons coming apparently from nowhere and claiming admission to their lodges. In order to make admission of such men to lodges more difficult, Grand Lodge issued an order to make certain changes in the methods of proving or testing, including the transposition of the words of the first and second degrees. But not all lodges obeyed this order. Many lodges in England had an appreciable proportion of members of Irish origin, and no doubt many Scottish Masons also had migrated to England, and the influence of these would tend towards the maintenance of the older tradition and practice. In any case, the lodges that were in opposition to Grand Lodge on this or other grounds, most of which had never come under the jurisdiction of Grand Lodge, gradually grew together, and probably as early as 1739 a committee had been formed to coordinate their activities. And the work of that committee culminated in the formation of a rival Grand Lodge in 1751. Then ensued a long period of bitter rivalry between the two Grand Lodges until their union in 1813. The history of this period is not only intrinsically interesting to Masonic students, but it also provides much material that is relevant to our present study. The new Grand Lodge took the title of the most antient and honorable society of free and accepted Masons. They claimed that they had adhered to the antient landmarks of the order, from which the others had departed, and on this account they became known as the Antients, while the older Grand Lodge were dubbed the Moderns, and both these designations have been retained ever since. Among the defections of which the Antients accused the Modems, the following may be noted as relevant to our present purpose. 1. That they had ceased to read the old charges at initiations, thus abandoning a landmark. 2. That they had de-Christianized Freemasonry. The old charges had been, almost without exception, of a positively Christian character, but the first of the regulations that were embodied in Anderson's constitutions of 1723 stated that 'tis now thought more expedient only to oblige them, the Freemasons, to that religion to which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves. 3. That they had transposed the modes of recognition of the first and second degrees as already indicated above. 4. That they omitted the deacons from their office bearers. 5. That they had abandoned the esoteric ceremony of installed master. 6. That they had curtailed the ceremonies, and in particular had neglected the lectures or catechisms attached to each degree. The Grand Lodges of Ireland and Scotland had sympathized with those lodges who had resisted the changes ordered by the original Grand Lodge, and they maintained very close and amicable relations with the new Grand Lodge when it was formed in 1751. It may be of interest to note how close that relationship was at the highest levels. In 1756, a former Grand Master of Ireland, the Earl of Blessington, was elected Grand Master of the Antients. He was succeeded, in 1760, by the Earl of Kelly, who was Grand Master Mason of Scotland in 1763–65. The third Duke of Atholl was Grand Master of the Antients from 1771 to 1774 and Grand Master Mason of Scotland in 1773, so that he held both offices simultaneously for a period. The same is true of the fourth Duke of Atholl, who was Grand Master Mason of Scotland 1778 to 1779, and was Grand Master of the Antients from 1774 till 1781 and again from 1791 till 1813. And in the period between 1781 and 1791, the Grand Master of the Antients was the Marquis of Antrim, who was Grand Master of Ireland in 1773 and again in 1779. It may be of particular interest to Scottish Masons to know that the Antients were known as Atholl Masons. And even the official yearbook of the United Grand Lodge of England refers to the Atholl or Antient Grand Lodge. In 1813, the Duke of Atholl was succeeded by HRH, the Duke of Kent, son of George II. Though the rivalry between the two Grand Lodges in England was very acute, there were enlightened brethren in both bodies who realized the wrongness of this division and worked to find a way towards union. Ultimately, on 26 October 1809, the modern Grand Lodge issued a charter or warrant to the Lodge of Promulgation, so named because it was formed for the purpose of promulgating the ancient landmarks of the society and instructing the craft in all matters and forms as may be necessary to be known by them. The work done by this lodge represents the beginning of a process that culminated, nearly 40 years later, in the final formulation of our modern ritual as we know it today. The Lodge of Promulgation, when they had completed the work allotted to them, reported back to the modern's Grand Lodge that they had a confident persuasion of having derived the most authentic information from the purest sources, as henceforth to render all the ceremonies of the craft, in practice simple, in effect impressive, and in all respects conformable to ancient practice. What this amounted to in actual fact was that they accepted practically all the antient practices and matters on which there had been differences between the two bodies with one notable exception, namely that they tacitly accepted the position reflected in the first article and regulations incorporated in Anderson's Constitutions of 1723, referred to above. The Lodge of Promulgation ceased to function in 1811. On the side of the Antients, their Grand Lodge appointed a committee in 1810 to explore the prospects of achieving union, and their report led to that Grand Lodge deciding that a Masonic union, on principles equal and honorable to both Grand Lodges, and preserving the landmarks of the antient craft, would, in the opinion of this Grand Lodge, be expedient and advantageous to both. The union of the two Grand Lodges was finally effected and ratified on 1 December 1813. At that time the Duke of Sussex was Grand Master of the Moderns, and the Duke of Kent Grand Master of the Antients. They were both brothers of the Prince Regent, afterwards King George IV. On the motion of HRH, the Duke of Kent, HRH, the Duke of Sussex was elected Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge, and he was installed as such on St. John the Evangelist's Day, 27th December 1813, and he continued to hold that office for 30 years. On 7th December 1813, 6 days after the union had been ratified, the Lodge of Reconciliation was warranted. This lodge was composed of well-known brethren from each Grand Lodge, and its purpose was to reconcile the working of previous modern lodges and previous antient lodges so as to ensure uniformity of working in all the lodges throughout England. They built on the foundation that had been laid by the Lodge of Promulgation, and their method of procedure was to give demonstrations at various centers which the masters of lodges were invited to attend. They continued to function till 1816 and held 26 meetings. There are detailed records of 20 meetings, and from these records, considered in the light of subsequent history, and even though the minutes make no reference to lectures, it can be gathered that their demonstrations were not so much the actual working of the degrees as a detailed description of the working given in the form of questions asked by the master for the evening and answered by the wardens for the evening. Different brethren occupied these chairs at each meeting. At 9 of the 20 meetings referred to above, the master's chair was occupied by the Reverend Samuel Hemming, D.D., who later compiled the famous Hemming Lectures, to which further reference will be made shortly. After the Lodge of Reconciliation ceased to function in 1816, their work was continued by Lodges of Instruction, of which the most famous were the Stability Lodge of Instruction, formed in 1817, and the Emulation Lodge of Improvement, formed in 1823. It will be relevant to our present purpose to give more details regarding this method of giving instruction by means of the lectures. This method corresponds exactly to the 18th century catechisms, which embody references back to previous ceremonies of which we otherwise know nothing, but of the nature of which we can gather something from the questions and answers. Similarly, the early 19th century lectures refer back to the ceremonies of the 3 degrees, and it may be assumed with confidence that as the lectures were developed by the Lodge of Reconciliation, the actual ceremonies were being developed pari passu and gradually took more definite form. By 1816, Brother Hemming had compiled lectures on all 3 degrees, and these comprised 256 questions and answers on the 1st degree, 145 on the 2nd degree, and 78 on the 3rd degree. 10 years later, a minute of the Stability Lodge of Instruction, dated 21st April 1826, reads as follows: The Reverend Dr. Hemming was invited to preside, when the lecture, 1st degree, was ably worked by the Reverend Dr. Samuel Hemming, assisted by. At the close, the grateful thanks of the Lodge were tendered to Brother Hemming for presiding and for the advantage they enjoy in the possession of that lecture, which he has arranged with such skill and talent as to stand unparalleled in the Masonic world. According to the minutes, also, the Lodge seems to have worked only the lecture on the 1st degree until 28th September 1827. When that on the 2nd degree is mentioned for the first time, and that on the 3rd degree is not mentioned until 7th November 1828. As already indicated, the Emulation Lodge of Improvement was not formed until 6 years after the Stability Lodge of Instruction. Brother C. D. Roch, in his short treatise on the Lodge of Reconciliation 1813 to 1816, and its influence on present-day ritual, says, "It is not easy to understand why the Stability and Emulation Lodges of Improvement preferred to work by lectures only until after 1830. This may be difficult to understand, or we must accept the fact, noting that it applies to emulation as well as to stability. In the early days of the Emulation Lodge of Improvement, the dominating figure was Brother Peter Gilks, who, however, did not join it until 2 years after its formation. Brother Gilks was a very significant personality in English Masonic history of this period. Regarding him, Brother Hiram Hallett, in his short history of the Lodges of Promulgation, Reconciliation, Stability, and Emulation, says, "The Emulation Lodge of Improvement bases all its claims for preeminence on the assumption that they derive their ritual from this famous Masonic instructor." It may be relevant to give the following further quotation from Brother Hallett. When the method of imparting Masonic instruction by means of lectures began, it is impossible to say. About 1763 lectures by William Hutchinson were published, and in 1772 William Preston published his version. The ceremonies in those days were short and simple. The lectures were long and verbose. These lectures, however, containing all the essentials of the 3 degrees. It is not now possible to state when the rehearsals of the ceremonies supplanted them. The words long and verbose are no doubt true of Hutchinson and Preston, but are scarcely so applicable to the 18th century catechisms or the 19th century lectures. The Emulation Ritual was first published by A. Lewis in 1838, but it may be taken for granted that MS. copies were in circulation for some time before that. It may also be taken for granted that the Stability Ritual had been completed about the same time. Brother Roch states that all the present-day rituals, except those of Ireland, Scotland, and Bristol, may be said to be derived from Stability and Emulation. As regards the Scottish rituals, all those known to the present writer, with one notable exception in the west of Scotland, show extensive evidence of the influence of emulation. For example, in the ceremony of opening the lodge, many Scottish lodges reproduce questions and answers in the 2nd section of the 1st degree lecture. Others retain the substance of these but alter the wording, and some introduce questions that are not in the emulation ritual but the substance of which is in the emulation lectures. Throughout the ceremonies, even in those lodges where the 3rd degree is most dramatized, there are many passages in which the language of emulation is exactly or approximately reproduced. In the obligations, the language is very similar to emulation, though in some rituals additional details are introduced, and even in the notable exception referred to above, there are several phrases that are characteristic of emulation. These details are given here in support of the view that, notwithstanding a variety of workings in Scotland, there is at least a hard core in them all that is clearly the result of the development which it has been our purpose to outline in this paper. The time has come to summarize the result of our studies so far, and to point to some conclusions that may be drawn therefrom. We have seen that the first complete ritual was published in 1838. Before that, instruction was imparted by means of lectures in the form of question and answer, and in the stability and emulation lodges at least, by that means only until 1830 or thereabouts. It may be inferred, therefore, that the ritual probably received its final form between those dates, say about 1835. The ritual of 1835, whether stability, emulation, or other, is, in respect of scope, structure, and landmarks, essentially the same as our present-day rituals, notwithstanding the wide variety of workings that characterize Scottish Freemasonry. In these respects of scope, structure, and landmarks, it may be taken that all our Scottish rituals derive ultimately from the 1835 ritual, though in other respects many of them contain features that are indigenous to and characteristic of Scotland. Conversely, there are features in the 1835 ritual that had their original sources in Scotland. We have also seen that in all our present-day rituals there are elements that are to be found in very early Masonic MSS and other writings. Among these are the words B and J, which we find in the Edinburgh Register House MS, and in practically every 18th catechism. We must also include here the Hiramic legend, which first appears in Masonry dissected in 1730, but which appears to have been decided upon after a tryout of the same theme in a very different setting in the Noel legend as set forth in the Graham MS, 1726. But while the Noel legend was rejected for this purpose, there are many other elements in the Graham MS, including the idea of substituted secrets, that still characterize present-day Masonry. And a perusal of other 18th century catechisms will reveal quite a number of significant details with which we are all familiar. But there is also much in the 1835 ritual that was entirely new. To take but one example, the definition of Freemasonry as a peculiar system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbol, appears in the first section of the first-degree lecture, for the first time so far as the present writer is aware, and many other similar examples could be given. But by far the most significant and entirely new feature of the 1835 ritual was the wonderful way in which all the material that had accumulated during the 17th and 18th centuries had been examined and elements therefrom selectively chosen with insight and discrimination and built up into a peculiar system that is simply amazing in its symmetry, self-consistency, and completeness. The men who could compile such a system were truly learned and expert brethren. Let us consider what evidence we can find in any modern ritual that they were truly learned and expert. 1. They obviously had an intimate knowledge of the Hebrew Scriptures. But 2. In the Hiramic legend they departed, on a very essential point, from the scriptural record in order to bring the legend into line with the central mythos of the ancient mystery cults, such as those of Osiris, Dionysus, and others, in which the neophyte is identified with the tutelary hero. So it can be inferred that they had an intimate knowledge of these ancient mysteries. 3. It can also be assumed, though this is not explicitly indicated in the legend itself, but may be inferred from other intimations in the ritual and from various allusions in the 18th century catechisms, that they were familiar with the supreme presentation of the same theme in the identification of the Christian neophyte with Christ in his death and resurrection. 4. They were certainly deeply versed in the Hebrew Kabbalah, though this can only be recognized by those who are conversant with the Kabbalah. But it may be stated that points that can more reasonably be attributed to Kabbalistic origin than to any other source are the 3 pillars on which a lodge of Freemasons figuratively rests, the path of the candidate, in the course of his initiations, between 2 pillars, one on the left and the other on the right, and, above all, the point from which AMM cannot err, which the present writer regards as the most significant symbol in Freemasonry, with the exception of the TGL if the Kabbalistic association be adopted tentatively as a working hypothesis. A craftsman versed in the Kabbalah would soon recognize not only that the whole framework of our system is Kabbalistic, but also that a great many details that otherwise appear to have little or no particular point acquire a very real significance. A comparison of the TGL as a composite symbol with corresponding symbols in other systems will suggest that these learned brethren had an intimate knowledge of these other systems, or more probably had had a direct personal experience of the spiritual realities that these symbols represent. 6. A final point will be more easily recognized by all. The compilers of our system had an unparalleled knowledge of man's psychological and spiritual nature and needs, and they sought, both by explicit instruction and under a veil of symbolism, to show how these needs could be met. It may be recognized that these qualities characterized those learned brethren who finally formulated the 1835 ritual from the accumulated mass of material they had at their disposal. But the question naturally arises, did they characterize them only, or also those brethren who selected and preserved, during the preceding 150 years, the various elements that were incorporated into the 1835 ritual? We have seen that B and J are found in Masonry since at least the end of the 17th century, and also that of other details to be found at that time some, such as the FPOF, were retained but adapted to a different setting. We have seen, too, that the Noah legend appears to have been tried out, found to be inadequate and rejected, while the Hiranic legend was adopted some time prior to 1730 and been retained ever since. It seems not unreasonable to assume that that was made deliberately, and that the elements tried out were retained or rejected according to whether or not they were adequate for an ultimate purpose that the selectors had in view. Can we form any reasonable conjecture as to who these selectors might have been and who preserved and transmitted the selected elements? There is a long-standing tradition that the Rosicrucians had a considerable, if not a controlling influence in these matters, but this tradition has been consistently rejected by writers of the authentic school on the grounds that there is no direct documentary evidence to support it. But it has to be borne in mind that members of the Rosicrucian fraternity have never at any time publicly acknowledged such membership. This policy was at first adopted because it was a necessary precaution in view of the exigencies of the time, and in practice it has been perpetuated as an established tradition. There are, however, many historical facts which in their cumulative effect provide a considerable body of circumstantial evidence that suggests at least the possibility of such a Rosicrucian influence. 1. First, there is their original manifesto, the Fama Fraternitatis R.C., which was published in Kassel in 1614. This clearly shows that their aims and ideals were consonant with those of Freemasonry, that the order was essentially Christian, and that the Kabbalah had a basic place in their system of philosophy. 2. The Fama was widely studied in England and in Scotland during the 17th century. A manuscript translation dated 1633 in the handwriting of Sir David Lindsay, who was created first Earl of Balcarres, is still in the library of the Earl of Crawford and Balcarres, and a small book by Archdeacon J.B. Craven, D.D., on the esoteric studies of Robert Leighton, D.D., who was Bishop of Dunblane from 1661 till 1672, states that the libraries of various noble houses in Scotland also contain books of that period pertaining to such esoteric studies. 3. In 1652, there was published an English translation of the Fama by Thomas Vaughan, who, though he denies that he was a member of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, was nevertheless steeped in their teachings, as is evidenced by his many other writings. There is, however, no evidence that he was a Freemason, but he is known at least to have met Elias Ashmole. 4. The order is known to have been active in Europe during the 18th century, and there is very good reason to believe that it was then also active in England. Godfrey Higgins, in his Anacalypsis, says that a college of the fraternity was still working in London in 1830. The continuity of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood during that period suggests a possible channel by which the results of successive generations of those concerned in the selection of appropriate material could have been preserved and transmitted. These facts and possible inferences therefrom do not prove any direct connection between Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry, but if they are taken all together, and if what is known of Rosicrucian teachings be correlated with what is stated in this paper about the development of our ritual between 1696 and 1835, it must surely be agreed that such a connection was at least possible, and that Brother R.F. Gold could have had quite adequate grounds for his statement, already quoted, that during the 16th and 17th centuries, Kabbalism and Rosicrucianism profoundly influenced many secret societies in Europe, and Freemasonry received no slight tinge from the Kabbalistic pursuits of some of its adherents at that time. In any case, one might ask those who refuse to accept, even as a working hypothesis, the possibility of such a connection, what alternative hypothesis they can offer that could more adequately and reasonably account for the wonderful perfection of our peculiar system, the completeness, the self-consistency, the symmetry not only of the broad framework, but also of all the details that are so skillfully wrought into that framework. In any case, we are surely justified in exclaiming, "O wonderful Masons! All glory to the Most High." Extracted from the Yearbook, Grand Lodge of Scotland, 1960. One thing, and only one thing, a Masonic Lodge can give its members which they can get nowhere else in the world. That one thing is Masonry. Carl H. Cloudy. Subscribe to Masonic Audiobook Library.